Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're connecting from around the world today. My name's Rob Dietel. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's UNICON webinar, Why Companies Don't Use Business Schools. Just a quick reminder and a few housekeeping items before we get started. Today's program, today's webinar, is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording afterwards that you can either review the program again or share it with colleagues. And in addition, we'll be making a copy of the slides, today's presentation, available as well. You'll receive that with the link to the recording. A few points. It's nice to have so many people joining us. It's been a while since our last UNICON webinar, and we're delighted to be re-engaging with you with a very important topic, looking and exploring at some of the reasons why companies are resistant to using or partnering with business schools throughout the world. A lot of information is going to be covered in a relatively short period of time. Our format today will have Andrew Crisp delivering the presentation, leaving some time at the end for questions and answers. You'll be able to submit your questions and answers through the question box at the bottom of your screen or in your navigation panel, and we'll be able to share those with Andrew. And I'm certain that with the topic and the material that we're covering today, there will be lots of questions. Just a quick reminder that this webinar, like all UNICON events, is subject and complies with the UNICON antitrust competition statement. The details of the antitrust competition statement are available on your screen now, but you can always refer to the UNICON policy guide for further antitrust policy details. Really happy to have Andrew Crisp leading us through today's webinar. Andrew has deep experience in this field and has really brought some great insight to this topic. He's the co-founder of Carrington Crisp, which he co-founded in 2003, and has considerable experience in research, strategy, and communication. He's worked with many universities around the world, including INSEAD, IMD, Columbia, Babson, and many others as well. Prior to setting up Carrington Crisp, Andrew led the agency team that carried out the London Business School's rebrand. He's a frequent contributor and speaker, often quoted in the media, drawing on his knowledge of business education for the Financial Times, The Economist, Business Because, and many other publications. As I think you'll see through his presentation, I was able to preview it earlier this week. He really has done some great work in exploring some of the themes and trends that are affecting business schools today, not just in light of the pandemic, but I think from a wider lens in terms of how things are shifting. So without any further delay, it's my pleasure to bring Andrew Crisp to the screen. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. And it is a pleasure for me to be here and taking part in this webinar this afternoon, this evening, as you said, wherever people are in the world. So let me give you a little bit of background, first of all. So the data I'm going to share with you today, the majority of the comments are based on a piece of research that we did for the Executive MBA Council, or at least they led the consortium that I think UNICON, AACSB, GMAC, one or two others were part of. And the work was carried out in the middle of last year. The report was published in October. It's available on the Executive MBA Council's website, and I think will be made available as well to participants today in an email tomorrow. There'll be a link to that. The study itself, international study, comprised a number of elements and desk research, interviews with employers and business schools, and two surveys, one of employers and one of individual learners. And we'll share some of the data from the study as we go through. Now, first, the good news. This was one of the headlines that came out of the study. Just over half of the businesses in the study say they use business schools for learning and development. And that's great. And of course, many of you listening today will have been part of that experience. It sounds a little strange, but I'm a little uncertain about whether this is a fair and accurate representation of the marketplace, simply because I suspect that 53 is dominated by larger organizations. If we look at markets worldwide, sometimes as many as 90% of businesses in a local area can be small and medium-sized enterprises, under 350 employees potentially, perhaps many actually under 50 employees. Are they using business schools for their learning and development? Sometimes. Of course, there's some very good programs out there. The 10,000 Small Businesses campaign that Goldman Sachs have got behind has been a good example of engaging those small businesses. There's talk that here in the UK, in the budget statement we get from the Chancellor tomorrow, there'll be money to support development of small and medium-sized enterprises and the learning that managers in those businesses need, particularly in terms of COVID recovery. But so whilst this is a good starting point, whether it's sufficient will be an interesting question. I suspect also many of those listening today will have heard some of these comments. I didn't know you did that. Often a starting point, for an employer speaking to a business school. They weren't simply aware their perception of a business school was simply that it was a degree centered organization because that was their own personal experience. They don't know how to get in touch. They think business schools are out of date. They're so slow and behind the world of today. They're too expensive, and it's simply not right for our organization. Well, I hope the webinar will go a little deeper and provide you with a little more around these issues rather than these simple headlines. And a good place to start is this question. We asked, if they didn't use business schools, what were the reasons? And there were 4 that stood out here. So first of all, this idea that the programs business schools are offering don't meet their development needs. Well, there's very little, in the immediacy that you can do about that. If you're not providing what they want, of course they'll look elsewhere. Secondly, business schools are too theoretical, not sufficiently abreast of the real world challenges that companies face. Well, there's something to be done about that. Schools can explain about the impact, and we'll come back to that point a little later in my comments, the impact that they do make with organizations. And that's going to be really important going forward, I think. Schools don't have the specific expertise that they're seeking. And again, there is something in that. If you're looking for a particular piece of learning, a particular piece of information, a particular piece of knowledge, and it's not there in the business school, that can be a problem. But it may well be there in a wider institution that a business school is part of. And again, I'll touch on this thought about partnerships later. And then back to impact. We've not seen any real impact back in the workplace after investing in a business school program. And this is going to become ever more important as companies have to justify their spend on executive education and lifelong learning. And you only have to look at the story in the Financial Times last week that suggested a large number of schools have perhaps lost a third of their income in the executive education marketplace because of the pandemic. As the recovery comes, more and more employers will ask about this question of impact. Can you show us a return on investment for the money that we might spend with your business school? So 4 key reasons here that people said were important for not working with business schools, but there's more to it than that. I think, first of all, it's about understanding the world we're living in today. And a little bit of context is helpful. Many of you will be familiar with Linda Grattan's work on the 100-year life about how we're living longer, and therefore there are all sorts of consequences as a result of that in terms of our work. So 4 things that came out of the study. First of all, half of the individuals said they expect they'll have to learn new skills to advance their career in the future. Remaining employable in a world which has seen an explosion in the gig economy and different ways of working, with many people working in different setups, particularly over the last year, is going to be incredibly important. And because people are living longer, it means working longer in many cases. You can see at the bottom there, just over a quarter expect to be working into their 70s. And when we ask today's students, as we did in another study last year, that number grows, typically to 40 to 50% of new graduates leaving university age 21, 22 expect to be working into their 70s. And within that lifetime of work, you see half almost expecting to start a business or work for themselves, back to that gig economy idea. 31% expect to change career completely at least once in their lifetime. The idea of a job for life or even a career for life is becoming less common. With a 16-year-old daughter, I'm so aware that there is no great desire amongst her generation to stick in a certain area And again, you'll see that comes back. She may have values and they may inform what she wants to do career-wise, but it doesn't necessarily mean she'll want to do the same job forever and ever and ever. What else is it important to understand in terms of context, and perhaps another reason why people don't engage with business schools? Know your audience. It's a simple thing. It's taught in business schools so often, but knowing your audience is so important. And when we asked individual learners in the study last year for MBAC how they saw themselves, these were the top 5 answers. Now, you'll look at this and you'll say, well, yes, people always are eager to explore their potential. Perhaps the rest, though, is slightly different from where we've seen things in the past. So curious to find new ways to create value. Less of a surprise, perhaps. People seeing themselves as creative people, that's been growing for a while. Highly analytical, we've seen the growth in terms of data analytics as an important part of careers. And ambitious to achieve positive change. I think that's more new. I think there's more there about how society's been changing. We've seen social movements over the last year really come to the fore. We've seen greater talk about ethics, about responsible management, about equality, diversity, and inclusion. All of these are much more to the fore. And you'll see in the data shortly, are not just things that individual learners are focused on, but corporates are acknowledging their importance as well. One final thing, you'll have seen the backdrop to this Zoom call that I have up. I live in Cornwall in the far west of England, a lovely part of the world, as I hope you'll see there. What is interesting about Cornwall is what we've seen happen over the last year during the pandemic. So this is St Ives. It's a coastal town. I think it's about 11,000 people, permanent residents. So not a big town, but a popular location for holidays, has an outpost of the Tate Gallery from London. And the G7 summit this June, which is going to be hosted by Boris Johnson, will take place just up the road. But it's 5 hours on the train. It is one flight a day from an airport, 45 minutes away. And yet, in the last 6 months, 170% increase in property sales. The idea that working from home is going to evaporate after the pandemic is over, it is simply a falsehood. Yes, some will want to go back to the office, some will want a blended solution, but some will want to simply carry on working in somewhere like St Ives, but potentially be working for a company in London. I heard a presentation from Coursera recently where they have now gone location agnostic, I suppose, in terms of their recruitment. So you can be anywhere and work for Coursera. That is a new reality that is changing the sorts of things that people will want to learn, the way that companies will behave. And so often much of executive education has a leadership focus. Well, now it will have to have a focus on a different type of leadership, distributed leadership, for want of a better phrase. The way people will lead teams, manage teams, motivate teams when they're not even in the same room. Not just on a day, but perhaps a week, a month, a year, and finding the capacity to deliver these new types of learning, new types of programs for organizations will be another way for business schools to draw in conversations with corporates. So understanding the context of the world that business schools operate in, that the wider society is going to be incredibly important for growing relationships. Let me take this a little bit further and share some more data. What does business want when it's looking at learning and development? What does it want from business schools? Well, here's an interesting chart. So we asked employers which skills were important to them and which skills were available to them when they went into the labour marketplace. And some surprises, some not surprised. So at the top there, you can see leadership. It's incredibly important, but it's also felt to be widely available. Not necessarily the right type of leadership, but it is sensed to be widely available. There's some other things in there, the things that you'd expect to see, perhaps, communication skills, managing across culture, global mindset, risk management. But then the opposite to leadership, down at the bottom, managing a multi-generational diverse workforce. Over 80% of the response said it was important, but fewer than 20% said that it was available to them in the labour marketplace. So if you're going to think about the programs, you're going to think about what it is that business will want in the coming years, there's a big signal for you. Offer programs that are going to help them manage these multi-generational diverse workforces better. Perhaps one or two surprises. Well, I said, bottom left, crisis management. Might have been further to the right, one would have expected, given the times we've just been through in the last year, but not widely available. The second least available skill that employers are looking for. Some other things in there, ethics and ethical behavior, actually reasonably high in terms of availability, certainly close to the 40% mark there, and not that far to the right. Marketing, though, by contrast, something that's readily available and perhaps not so important because it is so widely available amongst some of the employers we spoke to. So some interesting data beginning to come out about the new things that may be important for employers going forward. We asked the respondents, so the employers, what has been driving their learning developments in the past year. So always a good starting point, what has been important and therefore might be important going forward. So largely driven by new technology and digital transformation. I'll come to it again in just a moment, but it is a big driver. Inevitably improving productivity and efficiency, and that's been a standard for a long while. Maintaining professional standards and competencies is always going to be there, and there we are again, building a workforce fit for future business needs. It's a little bit of what we had in the last slide, this diverse workforce that needs to be managed and grown and encouraged, but it's also making sure the right skill mix is there. Rather than yesterday's skills, what are we going to need for the next 2 years? And that brings me on to this next one. So what are the priority learning needs over the next 3 years? And there it is, number one, digital transformation. This is corporates who are answering this question. Secondly, equality and diversity. Third, artificial intelligence. There it is again, productivity and operational efficiency, data analytics and data-driven decision-making. And I think what is interesting here again is, are these things that business schools naturally can provide? Digital transformation, change management programs, absolutely. Equality and diversity, perhaps a little bit less. Artificial intelligence, I don't know many business schools who on their own can claim to be experts in artificial intelligence. Productivity, of course, and data analytics has very much been a growing theme, a growing provision in business schools. Perhaps this speaks to something that's very important. The need for partnerships, for alliances, for collaboration, whether that's within an institution and other parts of that institution. So computer science faculties perhaps drawing in artificial intelligence, whether that's with other providers, and we'll talk about other providers in just a moment, or whether it's about working with third parties, with other organizations, perhaps drawing in other things that are important for employers, and thus building alliances that can drive new business for business schools. And I think it's some really interesting questions there as to what might be important for employers going forward. And here's a good example of some data to back this up. So we looked at, LinkedIn run this emerging jobs report, and this is from December 2019, so a little out of date, but it was a part of the study last year. And you look down these 15 lists of jobs, and very few of them, again, are jobs that would naturally look to business schools to acquire the skills they need to succeed. There's a couple in here, perhaps customer success specialist there at number 6. A little further down, chief revenue owner, product owner, but most of these are IT related. That may make business schools think, well, where do we have an opportunity here? But the opportunity is in managing these people, in leading these people and delivering the projects that these roles are working on. So this idea of technology management, for want of a better phrase, has very much been something we've seen coming to the fore over the last 5 years or so, where perhaps an MBA student is required, or an MBA graduate rather, is required to run project teams in areas that they have little technical expertise. understanding the background to these, being able to run those projects still successfully is a project management task, a task that business schools can deliver on, that they have lots of expertise in. So it's about creating that alliance with a computer science department to make sense for the employer, for the customer in terms of delivery. Of course, it's not necessarily an easy task. We did a project a few years back with a university here in the UK. They have a good business school, been able to charge £1,000 a day for some of its custom programs. And yet, when you looked at the other parts of the university, although it had a very good statistics department, which did run programs for corporates, they were charging £300 a day. And understanding how they could make that transition to the same sort of level as the business school was a very difficult exercise. And consequently, it was hard to move forward on those alliances. But those alliances are a necessity, and finding ways to make those collaborations work will become ever more important going forward. So here's a quote from one of the employers from last year's study. And I think this sums up some of those things we've been talking about and leads into this interesting question of impact. As it said, they don't send people on executive training. Yes, they considered in the past, but the ROI simply wasn't there. Yeah, they were going to build their own executive learning program, but due to cost, it didn't get off the ground. This is an interesting question. I think cost is incredibly important for some of the customers business schools are seeking to engage with, but not all. And here it is, when we ask employers how they choose a provider to work with, let's go to that last bullet point first. Cost of provision was least important, ranked 10th, 11th, or 12th out of the 12 that we provided by 41% of the respondents. But again, maybe this is part of what I was talking about at the beginning, this idea that large corporates perhaps are a little less focused on cost than smaller organizations. But what is important, without a doubt, reputation as the provider. Now that might be rankings, it might simply be historic, it might be that it's come through social media, but reputation as a provider are very important. Content that's clearly related to business needs and challenges. So back to this point, why do we not use business schools at the very beginning? Because they don't provide what I'm looking for. So that's incredibly important. Then the third one, staff with a deep understanding of our business sector. Again, that may be a question of alliances, and not alliances necessarily across a single institution, but maybe alliances between business schools, where one business school has a strength in finance, another has a strength in marketing, another has a strength in HR, bringing those together to meet that deep understanding of a business sector that's required. And then this impact question, more than anything else, if an employer wants to keep doing this sort of work, if they want to keep engaging with a business school, if the business school wants them to remain as a customer, then finding a way to demonstrate impact is incredibly important. And let me talk a little bit more about that, because we ask both organizations and individuals about how they considered impact. So for organizations, 4 things seem to be important in terms of measuring: customer satisfaction, productivity, growth, sales, reduced costs, financial performance, maybe that's something of the same, and achievement of general organizational goals. It's incredibly difficult sometimes to measure that impact. For too long, schools and organizations sort of relied upon the happy sheet. Did you have a good experience? How were the lunches? What were the facilities like? Was that the right course for you? Today, the technology allows us to do so much more. It means that in real time, you can be assessing the performance of individuals and therefore the impact of the actual learning and development that's going on. And you can look at how that learning and development can be improved such that individuals get more out of it and a corporate gets more out of it. And when we ask individuals about impact, what was important for them, that they wanted to see improved leadership, better communication skills, successfully introducing new tools and processes of work, personal productivity, those sorts of things that are perhaps not surprising, decision making, time management, and then at the bottom, a clearer strategic thinking and approach. So really helping them both with their particular roles and particular skills, but also giving them this wider, longer perspective, thinking about their careers and the roles that they are in. So finding smart ways to measure impact is going to be incredibly important. And often that means thinking about it at the outset of a project, almost before you get to the first day of learning. Because if those metrics are a part of the planning, then it'll be easier to measure them at the end, and it will be easier to work with a client to say, did we hit the targets? Have you got the data? What does this mean about the next iteration of this program? And that's incredibly important going forward. So where is business heading? What might the future look like? Another quote here, a very simple thing. Every time I look on a business or website, I can't find what I want or any information for custom programs. It's really frustrating. Custom programs just say, give us a call to discuss. And I think this is a lovely, this is a quote from last year, but it could have come from a project we ran 10 years ago. We worked with Cranfield School of Management, Cranfield University at the time. And we were doing some work looking at their website, and they particularly were interested in whether corporates use their website. And so we did some interviews, and the result came back that yes, as a corporate, we'd be more than happy to use the website, but we tended not to. And why we didn't was a very simple thing. We wanted a telephone number. We wanted to be able to pick up the telephone and speak to Cranfield. And so often we had to dig through several pages to find that telephone number. This is 10 years ago. What was important then, though, that is also important now, is when we made a call, there was somebody at the other end who knew what they were talking about. Maybe they weren't the person who was going to deliver the program, but they were the person who could speak about what was available. They had that competency in terms of working with the customers as well, was able to point somebody in the right direction, connect them, set up a meeting, whatever it might be. So both the means of communication and the quality of the communication become incredibly important in developing customer relationships. And it can be very simple things like a phone number and somebody with some knowledge. But what does the future look like from the surveys from last year? Well, a great deal of interest in more blended learning and online delivery. No surprise, they're exactly what we'd have expected and what we've seen over the last year. Large numbers again saying that short programs leading to a certificate with the option of credit for further studies leading to degree. So the idea of perhaps a stackable approach to learning. So rather than an entire program in one sitting, the idea that you pull out modules that are relevant for you in the current state of your career, current problems you're facing in your organization, and short bursts delivered flexibly, providing micro-credentials are a good way of meeting development needs. This idea of, if you like, just-in-time learning, not just-in-time supply, but just-in-time learning, giving me something that I can pick up, as you'll see in a question, on a Monday and apply on a Tuesday. And what would they look for in future employees? Two areas particularly highlighted. So we're back to embracing digital transformation. We're bringing together technology and management skills and challenging views by combining innovative and critical thinking. So you've got the new there, the technology and management, but you've also got critical thinking, which has always been a mainstay of a university education. The question is how to bring that forward and develop it and make it relevant in the future. But that is very clear that employers are saying, yes, technology to support our learning. Yes, quick, flexible approaches to learning. And yes, we're also still interested in those mainstays of critical things. So a change, but not a change, if you like, but perhaps a change in application more than anything else. And then there's this question of what the classroom of the future looks like. One of the things that came out very clearly in last year's study was that the idea of luxury learning, that the senior management team of an organization would go away to a five-star hotel for a week, and yes, there'd be some learning, but there might be some relaxation and entertainment and other things alongside it. This was really on its last legs, whether that was for cost reasons, whether that was for time reasons, whether that was for simple PR reasons. It was becoming less and less of an issue. Instead, you have this idea of blended learning. The digital wrapper or the digital thread that was going to run through everything, that would be there before perhaps to help get people up to speed before some learning, would be part of the learning, and potentially would be there after as well to make sure the learning had most effect, whether that was through coaching or some other thing. Perhaps it would be this stackable approach to learning. And perhaps it might also mean alternative providers and qualifications. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that this picture of a coffee shop is the classroom of the future in terms of the learning, but clearly for some it will be. And that has implications as well. Something that I really hadn't thought about that came out in last year's study very clearly was online learning is perhaps more of an issue in some parts of the world than others. If you're living in a part of the world where space is limited, you perhaps have a small flat where you live and you have a family in that flat, then having the space to actually learn online is a problem, especially in a pandemic when you can't go out to the local coffee shop and sit with a coffee for 2 or 3 hours and do some online learning. So understanding culture and society in different parts of the world is also going to be significant in terms of why people don't engage with business schools. And this point about alternative providers, I come to it in just a moment. This quote I said, we're back to speed, we're back to flexibility, we're back to applying what I've learned in a very quick timescale. This just-in-time learning theory that has very much gained momentum over the past year. But a little bit about alternative, new providers, whatever you want to call them. We asked about a whole range of these people. Not surprisingly, brand name was important. LinkedIn Learning was the one they were most aware of. It was also the one that was most used among the services listed. And I heard some data just a couple of weeks ago that during the last year, there's been a 130% increase in traffic on the LinkedIn Learning site. So people sitting at home, perhaps a little time to spare, thinking about their future careers, have been looking to use these sorts of services. FutureLearn is there, edX is there, Coursera was there, Udemy was there. All of these services are beginning to gather some momentum in terms of individual learners looking to pick up skills that they can use very quickly within their current careers that will help them remain employable, succeed on a particular project, and hopefully move forward to another level. I thought this was an interesting quote as well, which sort of spoke to some of this. A comment from an employer, comment really speaking back to what I was saying about my daughter earlier on as well. Perhaps people not seeing jobs as careers, so staying for shorter periods than previous generations, and their desire for learning goes beyond the role they're in. The long-term view of what they're interested in, so values rather than specific content. And they describe them as boomerang employees. So people who will stay for a short time, then want to go and do something else, perhaps mix it up with some learning, but they may well come back. McKinsey used to be very good at this in terms of their alumni and looking at where they might go into other organizations, then perhaps leveraging what they'd learnt in those organizations back in McKinsey before they left again in the future. But this is becoming a more common setup that we're seeing in many places. So how might the future be different for business schools? What might they have to think about to build this engagement with employers? Well, first of all, it's not Alcoholics Anonymous, but it is about acknowledging there's a problem. And here are 3 quotes which really set it up rather nicely. First of all from business schools. So if we can't identify the relevance, we should close a program. Easily said, very easily said, much harder to do. But it is something that more and more schools will have to think about. Secondly, no longer can we sit back and say you should value us because we are a business school. That's not enough. To be able to say that we're engaged in society, that we have these collaborations, these alliances, that we understand how business is developing, that we are close to business, but still far enough removed to have a critical perspective. And then the final one, business is going to get more complicated in the next few years. Are business schools going to be the place where leaders look for solutions? And just going back to that last slide about alternative providers, perhaps not. But if the answer is yes, it doesn't matter how we deliver. But if we have none of the answers, people won't come, and we can't keep teaching the same content as before. And that's critically important, I think, to understand that, whilst it's useful to look at the past to understand, to go forward, it's also important to have an imagination that says things are going to be different. We're going to deliver in different ways. Some of the content is going to be different. It's not going to be the same business model as perhaps has existed in the past. And I thought this was a really nice way of summing it up, again, from the employer. Yes, we work with universities, but purely in building a pipeline for engineering and technology roles, so technical skills of clear. We don't engage with business schools. The sorts of things we look for, the ambiguity and ability to adapt, to change quickly. Can you buy that through a degree program? Can you buy it through an executive education program? How do you buy it? How do you develop it? Does it require more than a business school provides? And then that's back to this question of, can a school work in alliance or collaboration to build this bigger picture, this bigger offer to business itself? And then it's about understanding the future. And again, two great quotes from employers. This first one, average age of our workforce is 32, so really young. Some senior staff struggle. Those colleagues who find it difficult to be inclusive or don't have an active growth mindset. One of our values is no egos. It's really effective. So people talk about millennials and Generation X and Generation Y, Generation Z. There is something in it. The labels are perhaps a little bit restrictive in themselves, but there is something in different ways of thinking amongst different age groups. And so back to this point about managing a diverse workforce being incredibly important. And then secondly, this other comment, 8 years on, our founder is still the CEO of the company, still holding a weekly meeting from his living room. Anyone in the company, over 3,000 staff, can attend via video link and ask questions. He really does answer them all. It's a weekly update on numbers, projects, and culture with good engagement levels. And I was thinking about this morning. I was doing another webinar, and there was a discussion about formal education. And it made me think of the Golden Globes that have just taken place. And of course, in the old world, for want of a better phrase, people would have turned up in their fancy clothes on a red carpet in Hollywood. This time, they were in their jogging bottoms, their pajamas. It's still a good event. And this webinar this morning, yes, I'm sitting here in my lounge. I've got my jeans on. Had I been doing the presentation on a university campus 2 years ago, suit, tie, it would have felt like very formal learning, but the learning was still just as valuable. It was still taking place, but it was a much more informal approach to learning. And you can then use the technology to make more of that learning, whether it's following up on social media, as the people were planning to do, whether it's tracking some of that learning and knowledge in using technology. There are all sorts of ways of turning that informal learning into something more. And that's going to be an important issue to think about. And then hearing the message. So when we ask employers whether they agreed or disagreed with each of the statements listed below, more than 3/4 said they felt there were different ways that business schools needed to change. First of all, reinventing MBA degrees to make them relevant for the future. We could spend a whole series of webinars talking about this, and it's incredible the amount of work that we're being asked to do at the moment by business schools to look at the relevance of their MBA degrees and how they can be re-engineered for the future. Secondly, more flexible approaches to taking a degree that don't involve full-time study. There was a great piece in Singapore in the Straits Times last January, February time. They'd interviewed the education minister for Singapore, and he talked about the end of linear education. So the idea that an undergraduate would join at 18 and study for 3 or 4 years, they'd come out with their degree, then they'd go to work. They might come back and do a master's at some point later in their lives, but effectively it was a linear approach to education. Well, he was now saying, instead of engaging somebody for 3 or 4 years, they would look to engage somebody for 20 years at the National University of Singapore. The idea being that maybe they'd do a year or two of an undergraduate degree and then go out to work. And then in 3 years' time, come back to top that up, to complete it perhaps, but still not leave. They'd come back again in 4 or 5 years' time to add more skills, maybe through a formal master's degree, but maybe along the way, that have been doing some online learning, some blended learning to help them remain employable and to meet the skills needs that their employers have. So this flexible, non-linear approach to degree taking. not surprisingly, alongside that, an offer that meets the requirement of lifelong learning. And I think that the next two certainly are connected to that. So develop short, inexpensive programs to develop relevant skills for those working, and more closely with employers to develop programs relevant to the future work. So again, this understanding of where employers are and where they're going and what will be important for them in the future. And then this final point, I think, really speaks to this question of diversity. You know, how does a schools offer impact wider society, not just business and industry? What is it doing in terms of equality and inclusivity? What is it doing in terms of society? You know, how is it impacting on major global challenges, whether that's climate change, whether it's poverty, whether it's pandemics? Really important to put business education in a wider context. And individuals, when they're asked, have similar things as well. Yes, there are positives in their relationship with business schools. Networking, absolutely, very much to the fore. But 40% not really seen impact in terms of the benefits or observe positive contribution, the impact that their colleagues are having when they return from a program. And 46% saying schools are too expensive. However, and this is a really important point, 55% say they've studied at a business school before and that's their first choice for future learning. So turning alumni communities into learning communities is going to be an important part for many business schools over the next few years. I'm just going to end with two slides. First of all, a quote. I think this really sums up much of what I've spoken about so well. So an employer is saying, traditional business schools, product-centered like a vinyl LP, and the contemporary school needs to be more like Spotify. So this idea, it's this linear, it's the idea the Singapore minister was coming up with, that you can only move in one direction through education. Whereas Spotify allows you to bring different bits and pieces together to make up your own program. I had a great conversation with an Indian employer recently. They were talking about two interns they had working for them. One wanted to go on to work in a large corporate, one wanted to set up their own business. The one looking to go and work in a large corporate said they were taking a traditional MBA because that's what the corporate would want. But the one looking to set up their own business said, well, it's not really relevant for me, some of that. So I'm curating my own learning. I'm taking a program from here, another one from there, one from over there, one from an online provider, one from an international provider, and I'm building something that's right for me. So this more Spotify-like approach perhaps to learning is going to be important in the future. So just to conclude, what might the future look like? Five messages, I think. First of all, get closer to business. Understand what it wants and where it is heading. And I don't mean do more research, not in terms of academic research anyway. A lovely example, we did some work with Rotterdam School of Management a few years ago. And they started turning some of their academic research into short videos, 3 to 4 minute videos. And in part it was done because the audience they were trying to get to, the 30 to 40-year-olds in corporate organizations, had grown up with 3 to 4 minute pop music videos. And there was an easy relationship between that sort of communication that they already had and were in tune with, and therefore got more out of it. So understanding business, what it wants, where it's heading, making it easy to communicate with them. Secondly, this point that I've mentioned a number of times, building alliances across institutions, between institutions, with new providers and throughout society. So not just one-dimensional sort of business education type relationship, but thinking again about what it is that business wants and therefore how to provide it if it's not already available within a business school. Third, making it easy for business to get in touch, but also providing that data on impact and building systems and building approaches to learning and development that are cradle to grave, for want of a better expression. So think about the outcomes and the continuing education at the very beginning of the project. And all of this will mean business schools need to think about the staff they employ and the skill mixes that they have. Less of the university perhaps B2C approach and much more of the B2B approach. thinking about those who are comfortable and connected with technology, both in terms of the marketing of programs and the delivery of programs. And then it may sound slightly corny, but this last point, making the past better is unlikely to be the answer. Instead, create the future. And I absolutely passionately believe this. Of course, history is important. Seeing where you've come from, where mistakes have been made in the past, making that better will all be important. But to think that education and learning is going to be modeled on the past in the future is not the right way forward. Instead, imagination will come to the fore. Innovation will come to the fore. Creativity will come to the fore. It will be so important for business schools to understand change, to embrace change, to make change happen so that they can provide change for business, economy, and the wider society. And on that point, I'm going to stop, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation on the many forces and factors at play in shaping how business schools and executive education departments really engage with corporations and businesses in today's climate. At this point, we would love to take questions from the audience. Just a reminder to go ahead and submit your questions via the Q&A box on your navigation panel, and we'll be able to field those directly. In the meantime, I do have a couple of questions that have just come to mind as you went through the presentation. And one of the first things that struck me was how executive education departments engage with businesses varies in practice, depending on whether we're dealing with a business unit manager or an HR representative or learning and development representative. Do you have any sense from your research in dealing with businesses, who's driving these decisions on how they may or may not work with business schools?
It's a great question, Rob, and I think it's a changing answer, to be honest. I think we've seen the rise of the chief learning officer in a number of organizations, and so that has been a trend to more centralization, because many organizations have seen that a way of managing cost effectively and making efficient decisions. But I think we will see a little bit of a turn backwards over the next few years as organizations look for quicker decision making, more flexible decision making, whilst it may be that the centralized organization will establish a roster of organizations that a company can work with. The decision about who we work with and what program they deliver may actually come down more to a more business unit, that sort of level, because they'll need a quicker decision. They'll want new skills as part of their organization, and to go up through the levels and then come back down through the levels and have the conversations and go back and forth, that simply won't be quick enough for them. And if that is the case, that is more likely to push people away, dare I say, from the bureaucracy of business schools and to alternative providers who can quickly respond.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any questions quite yet in the Q&A or chat box. Actually, we did just get one. Now that people can take programs from anywhere in the world, do you think providers in certain geographies are more advantaged? For example, if travel to Asia for training may have been cost prohibitive for North Americans before, will online access to Asian-based expertise increase their business?
It's a really interesting question, Nancy, and I think that there's several answers to it. So one of the things that we'd seen prior to the pandemic was those programs that were delivering online, quite a number of online MBAs, were actually attracting a lot of local participants, strangely, and they were choosing to go down that route because it gave them the flexibility that they wanted in their studies, that they could study offline at different times that were convenient for them because of work or family or whatever it might be. Going forward, we're beginning to see that breaking down. And so brands are actually becoming key. If you have that big brand name in the marketplace, then it's beginning to attract more people from more different geographies, because the technology is allowing for the asynchronous learning. It's allowing for different types of study, bringing groups together in different geographies. So I think it may well be, whether it's Asia, North America, Europe, Africa, which other parts of the world, there will be more of this international study, picking up particular expertise. And in a way, I go back to when we first started Carrington Crisp. One of the first organizations we worked for was INSEAD, and we did some work in Singapore. And we spoke to a German MBA student, I recall very clearly, who'd come from BMW in Munich and was doing his MBA at INSEAD's base in Singapore. And we asked him why he was there. And he said, well, I think the future is Asia, and this is a great place to do Asia. And so even at that stage, you had people who were aware that if they wanted to get an understanding and experience and knowledge of something in particular, it was best to look somewhere else rather than on their doorstep. And those possibilities, particularly with highly rated brands, I think will become more and more. I think I've just seen this week, Hong Kong UST, an excellent institution, have just announced their first online MBA program. So again, there may be opportunities there. They will not be a cheap provider, of course, but there are other reasons for buying their product. So yes, I'm sure there will be more diversity in that sense, Nancy.
And another question, what are the types of partnerships business schools could enter into that would resonate with companies seeking education around tech management?
Great question, Jonathan. I think it's going to be a bit of diversity. So part of it may be looking at professional bodies, those who, so here in the UK, British Computer Society, and it's as an example per chance, but there will be other organizations who are looking to support organizations in that sort of area. It may be very small organizations, micro organizations, it may be individual consultants who developed a particular skill in a particular area, perhaps have worked in a certain field for some time and have developed a level of knowledge that is relevant to bring in. It may be that you look at some of the best computer science departments in other universities, if you don't have one in your own institution, and look at that opportunity. It may actually be some of those companies who are using technology. So one of the things that came out in the study last year, there was quite a bit of discussion with several employers about whether a Netflix style solution for future learning would be, and a little bit like the quote about Spotify I mentioned, would be a way forward. So perhaps one of the answers is finding organizations who are using technology in a different way and leveraging lessons from their experience. We're back to case studies to a certain extent, but leveraging that experience in other programs that you might provide.
Thank you. And a question from Tim. Has your research shown any shift in terms of how business schools are compared with or valued against other new emerging competitors, such as a consulting firm or edutech company?
Tim, good to hear from you. I hope all is well in China. It's an interesting question. We've done a couple of studies, not the one that I've spoken about today, but a couple of studies for individual business schools where we've asked about brand reputation and awareness of these providers. And I think where there's an interesting opportunity is where you've got them working together. Of course, the Coursera's, the 2U's, the Future Learns, all of these who are emeritus is another example where they're working with traditional business school providers to build their brands to a certain extent. What we are finding as well, and I think this is an important point, is that employers historically would have said when they got a CV with somebody who had done a lot of online learning on it, maybe this goes in the possible pile rather than the definite pile. What is happening today is those employers have HR staff and recruiters who have done some online learning themselves. And therefore, when they get a CV, which has a lot of online learning on it, it's not a surprise. In fact, quite often the question is, tell me more. I want to learn about this. I want to know about your experience. And so I think we're at a little bit of a tipping point in terms of views on traditional providers and new providers. And of course, you have people, can I say, MIT being a good example, but it could be at Harvard Business School with HBX as they had, or it could be Oxford Said with the programs that they have. You have these leading providers who are embracing online learning in some way, shape, or form. It may not be in their traditional MBA, but it may be in other programs that are offering, particularly in the executive education field. And as they do more and more of this, so employers will feel more and more comfortable about working with other online providers, whether they're the big brand names or whether they're new entrants?
Thank you. One question that I had as I heard you deliver the presentation, it struck me that at various parts, it seems like it's incumbent on executive education groups, not just to look outward, but to look inward as well. And for instance, you mentioned having people with specialized information in the right roles or special areas of expertise, a website that might have readily available information. Do you have any guidance or thoughts on how exec ed departments might prioritize as they look inward? What changes are most important?
To be honest, I think it's people. I think despite the technology being all pervasive and being so important, both in terms of connecting and delivering, it still comes down to the relationships that people form. And if those people have a clear understanding of the potential clients, of the way business is developing, if they're able to blend, for want of a better phrase, the soft skills with the technology, then getting the right people with the right experience, whether it's from the education world or potentially from the Netflix world or other providers, bringing that together, having those right sets of skills will be more important than anything else. Of course, a functioning website, but everybody has a reasonable website. So it's the people skills that are so important.
Thank you, Andrew. Any other questions? We're just approaching the top of the hour. We probably have time for a few more questions. If you'd like to submit your question via the Q&A box, we'll be able to respond. Andrew, one last question from me then. You mentioned the book, The 100-Year Life, and kind of looking at how changes in demographics may impact how we work with people and executives and approach our programming. Any sense that there might be a demographic sweet spot for executive education departments? In other words, we should target, in the lifelong learning cycle, we should target people between the ages of 30 and 40. Any thoughts there in terms of breaking down that customer life cycle?
I think it's a really interesting question, Rob. So you look at the provision more broadly of business schools, and typical ages for a full-time MBA have come down a little bit, but they're still probably 27 to 29. Typical ages for an executive MBA are perhaps around 37 to 39, that sort of age range. So that then asks, well, what about beyond 39? Where is this opportunity? If people are working to 70, that's another 30 years. And look back over the last 30 years, I think, LinkedIn started in 2003, Facebook in 2004. I think Weibo only started in 2009. So, we're talking 10 to 15 years, how quickly the world has changed. So for those 40 plus, thinking of another 30 years of working, there's going to be an awful lot of change. Increasingly, that group are unlikely to want to return full-time to campus. They'll have family commitments, they'll have busy jobs, so they'll look for flexibility. And so for executive education that is perhaps geared up to shorter courses and degrees, is geared up to flexible learning and making the most of the technology in terms of blended delivery, perhaps this is the area to focus on. But having said that, back to this point about alumni, building learning communities, somebody leaving as an undergraduate at 21, 22, you can't let go of them for 18 years. If you're coming back to them age 40 and you haven't spoken in 18 years, it's going to be an awfully hard conversation to get them back on board. So find little ways, find little things to keep them engaged with a view that perhaps, from those years 40 to 70, there is a bigger opportunity.
That's a great point and good guidance, I think. One final question from Calvin. Any insight into the downward pricing pressures with new entrants and competitors to exec ed providers and business schools?
Wow. I come back to this point about impact. If you can show a return on the investment, whatever that investment is, then you're going to be in a much better position. I was looking for another client recently, a project we were doing, at some of the new entrants to the executive MBA marketplace. I think it's Quantic is one of the providers. And essentially, some of their programs are free. There's no point even thinking that a business school can compete in that respect, other than perhaps we're back to this idea of a Spotify or a Netflix, that you can create very small micro pieces of learning and give them away because they provide an entry to a bigger piece of work that then somebody's going to pay for. And if you hook them with that smaller piece, then there's an opportunity. And I remember seeing a very good case study. I think it was an MIT case study about a program that had been run for free on a MOOC basis, had thousands of participants. There was then the opportunity to take a certificate, and that had brought the line down smaller. There was then an opportunity to take a master's degree, and that brought the numbers down perhaps to only 50 people. I can't remember the exact numbers, something like that. But the price of that master's degree was something like $40,000. So for giving that small thing away at the beginning to delivering that piece of business that ultimately was worth $2 million to an organization, that's a pretty good position to be in. And again, if you can maintain the relationship with those 50 people who did the master's degree, even better with those who did the certificate, then you've got a pipeline for much more going forward.
Well, Andrew, that brings us to the top of the hour. I'd just like to thank you again for a very informative webinar, for fielding questions and hopefully showing us all some really great insight into how business and exec ed departments are working today and will likely work in the future. I'd like to thank all of our participants in the audience today for joining us. We hope you'll certainly return for future UNICON webinars. Just a reminder that you will be receiving in the next day or so a link to a recording of this presentation and a copy of the slides. We hope you find that useful. And finally, just thanking the UNICON staff, Dan and Taryn, working hard behind the scenes to make sure that these webinars are run smoothly and efficiently. Thank you for all the work that you do. Andrew, any final thoughts before we close down for the day?
I don't think so, Rob. It's been a pleasure. Thank you to Dan and Taryn for setting things up, and for yourself for hosting me. I hope there are other opportunities in the future to work with UNICON in what I think is probably the most exciting part of business education at the moment. There's so much change, so much opportunity, and we look forward to being part of that.
Well, we'll hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everybody, and that concludes our webinar for today.